Have you ever wondered what happens when a king's disobedience doesn't just cost him his throne, but curses his entire bloodline for generations? What if I told you that the first king of Israel didn't just fall from grace, but left behind a legacy so dark that his descendants would face execution, exile, and a supernatural curse that would echo through centuries? This isn't just another ancient story buried in dusty scrolls. This is the chilling account of King Saul's bloodline, a family marked by divine judgment, tragic deaths, and consequences that stretched far beyond one man's rebellion. From the moment Saul first disobeyed God's direct command, something shifted in the spiritual realm. A curse was set in motion that would hunt down his children, his grandchildren, and their children after them. But here's what will shock you most. 7 of Saul's descendants were executed a single day, their bodies hung on a hill as a public display of divine justice. For 5 months, their corpses remained exposed to the elements, while a grieving mother kept vigil, protecting them from wild beasts and birds of prey. This wasn't just political revenge. This was the fulfillment of a supernatural curse that had been building for years. If you've ever questioned whether the sins of the father really fall upon the children, or if generational curses are real, then stay with me. Because what we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about justice, mercy, and the terrifying power of spiritual rebellion. Drop a Y in the comments if you're ready to dive deep into one of the Bible's most haunting family sagas. And don't forget to subscribe, because this story has layers that will leave you speechless. Let's begin at the moment when everything went wrong for the house of Saul. Picture this scene. The year is approximately 1020 BC, and the tribes of Israel are in crisis. For 2 centuries, they've existed as a loose confederation, ruled by judges who rise up in times of need. But now, something has changed. The Philistines, armed with superior iron weapons and war chariots, are pressing deeper into the Hebrew highlands. The old tribal rallies are no match for this organized military threat, and the people are desperate. They cry out to Samuel, the aging prophet and judge, with a demand that will reshape their entire nation. "Give us a king," they plead. "We want to be like the other nations around us." Samuel is troubled by this request, because he knows what they're really asking for. They're rejecting God as their ultimate ruler in favor of a human monarch. But God tells Samuel something that will send chills down your spine. Give them what they want. "They haven't rejected you, Samuel. They've rejected me." And so begins the search for Israel's first king. Samuel is walking through the territory of Benjamin when he encounters a young man who seems to embody everything a king should be. His name is Saul, son of Kish, and he stands head and shoulders above every other man in Israel. He's handsome, imposing, and comes from a wealthy family. When Samuel first lays eyes on him, God speaks directly to the prophet's heart. "This is the one I have chosen to rule my people." But here's the first hint that something dark lurks beneath the surface. Saul isn't seeking the throne. He's actually looking for his father's lost donkeys when Samuel finds him. There's an irony here that will become painfully clear as our story unfolds. The man chosen to lead God's people into battle can't even keep track of his father's livestock. Samuel anoints Saul in secret, pouring oil over his head while speaking words that must have seemed impossible to believe. "The Lord has anointed you ruler over his inheritance." Then Samuel gives Saul a series of signs that will confirm his calling. He'll meet men carrying bread, wine, and young goats. He'll encounter a procession of prophets, and the Spirit of God will come upon him so powerfully that he'll prophesy among them. Everything happens exactly as Samuel predicted. Saul is transformed by the Spirit of God, and the people witness this supernatural confirmation of his calling. When Samuel presents him publicly to the nation, Saul has to be pulled out from hiding among the baggage. Even at his coronation, there's something reluctant, almost fearful about this towering figure who will soon become their king. The early days of Saul's reign show promise. When the Ammonites threaten the city of Jabesh-Gilead, demanding to gouge out the right eye of every inhabitant as the price of peace, Saul responds with righteous fury. He cuts up a pair of oxen and sends the pieces throughout Israel with a message. This is what will happen to the oxen of anyone who doesn't follow Saul and Samuel into battle. 330,000 men respond to his call, and they defeat the Ammonites so decisively that no two enemies are left together. The people are ecstatic. They want to execute those who had questioned Saul's ability to save them, but Saul shows mercy. "No one will be put to death today," he declares, "for this day the Lord has rescued Israel." It seems like the perfect beginning to what could be a golden age. But if you look closely at these early victories, you'll notice something troubling. Saul's success depends entirely on his obedience to God and his willingness to follow Samuel's guidance. The moment he steps outside those boundaries, everything begins to unravel. The first crack in Saul's armor appears during a military campaign against the Philistines. Samuel has told Saul to wait 7 days for him to arrive and offer sacrifices before the battle. But as the deadline approaches, Saul watches his army beginning to scatter. Fear grips the hearts of his soldiers as they see the massive Philistine force assembled against them. The pressure mounts with each passing hour. On the 7th day, with Samuel nowhere in sight, Saul makes a decision that will haunt him for the rest of his life. He decides to offer the burnt offering himself, taking on the role of priest even though he has no authority to do so. The moment the sacrifice is complete, Samuel arrives, and his first words cut through Saul like a sword. "What have you done?" Saul's response reveals everything we need to know about his character. Instead of taking responsibility, he shifts the blame. "I saw that the men were scattering, and that you didn't come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." Notice how he makes himself the victim of circumstances rather than acknowledging his disobedience. Samuel's response is devastating. "You have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." This is the moment when the curse begins. Not a supernatural pronouncement with thunder and lightning, but a quiet declaration that Saul's dynasty will not continue. Somewhere out there is another man, someone whose heart beats in rhythm with God's own heart, and he will replace Saul on the throne. But Saul doesn't learn from this mistake. If anything, the knowledge that his kingdom is doomed seems to drive him toward even greater acts of rebellion. The next major test comes when Samuel gives him explicit instructions from God about dealing with the Amalekites, the ancient enemies of Israel who had attacked them when they were weak and vulnerable in the wilderness. "Go and attack the Amalekites," Samuel commands, "and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys." It's a harsh command, but it comes directly from God as judgment for the Amalekites' cruelty to Israel during the Exodus. Saul assembles 210,000 soldiers and marches against Amalek. The battle is a complete victory. The Amalekite forces are routed, their cities captured, their people defeated. But when the dust settles, Saul has once again chosen partial obedience over complete surrender to God's will. He captures Agag, the Amalekite king, alive. He keeps the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, and everything that is valuable. Only what is despised and weak does he completely destroy. In his mind, he's probably justifying this as wisdom. Why waste good livestock? Why not keep the king as a trophy of victory? But God sees it differently. That night, the word of the Lord comes to Samuel. "I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions." Samuel is so grieved that he cries out to the Lord all night long. The confrontation that follows will echo through history. When Samuel finds Saul the next morning, the king greets him with cheerful confidence. "The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." But Samuel's response cuts through the pretense. "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears?" What is this lowing of cattle that I hear? Once again, Saul shifts the blame. The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest. Notice how quickly he distances himself from the decision and how he calls God your God rather than our God or my God. Samuel's words in response will haunt Saul for the rest of his days. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. This is the moment when the curse deepens. Saul finally admits his sin, but it's too late. I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command in your instructions. I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them. Fear of man rather than fear of God has driven his disobedience, and now the consequences are irreversible. Samuel turns to leave, but Saul grabs the edge of his robe, and it tears. Samuel sees this as a prophetic sign. The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to one of your neighbors, one who is better than you. Then he adds words that will prove to be tragically prophetic. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind. For he is not a human being that he should change his mind. The final act of this confrontation is both dramatic and symbolic. Samuel calls for Agag, the Amalekite king, to be brought before him. Agag comes confidently, thinking the danger has passed. Surely the bitterness of death is past, he says. But Samuel's response is swift and final. As your sword has made women childless, so will your mother be childless among women. And Samuel cuts Agag to pieces before the Lord. This execution isn't just about completing the mission Saul failed to finish. It's a foreshadowing of the judgment that will eventually fall on Saul's own house. The king who showed mercy where God demanded justice will see no mercy shown to his own descendants. The sword that should have fallen on Agag will eventually claim the lives of Saul's sons and grandsons. From this point forward, Samuel never sees Saul again, though he mourns for him until the day he dies. The relationship between the prophet and the king is severed, and with it goes Saul's last connection to divine guidance and blessing. But the curse that has been set in motion will not be content to claim only Saul. It will reach into the next generation, and the next, leaving a trail of blood and tragedy that will shock even those who understand the severity of divine justice. The sins of the father are about to be visited upon the children in ways that will test the very limits of human endurance and faith. What happens next will reveal just how far the curse on Saul's bloodline will reach, and how the consequences of spiritual rebellion can echo through generations. The stage is set for a family tragedy that will become one of the most haunting stories in all of Scripture. But Saul's disobedience wasn't just a personal failure. It was opening a door to something far more sinister. When Samuel departed that day, something else departed with him. The Spirit of the Lord, which had once empowered Saul to prophesy and lead with divine authority, withdrew from the king. And in that spiritual vacuum, something dark rushed in to fill the void. 1 Samuel 16:14 records this chilling transition with stark simplicity. Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. This wasn't just oppression or anxiety as we might understand it today. This was a supernatural affliction, a tormenting presence that would drive Saul toward increasingly erratic and violent behavior. Picture the scene in Saul's court as this transformation begins to manifest. The servants whisper among themselves, watching their once mighty king descend into fits of rage and paranoia. They suggest bringing in a skilled musician to soothe his troubled spirit, and that's how a young shepherd named David first enters Saul's story. The irony is breathtaking. The very man who will replace Saul on the throne is brought into the palace to provide comfort for the king whose kingdom he's destined to inherit. David's music temporarily drives away the evil spirit, and Saul grows to love this young man who brings him peace. But even this relationship is tainted by the curse that now hangs over Saul's house. The moment David's true calling becomes apparent, that love will transform into a murderous obsession that will consume the rest of Saul's life. The transformation accelerates when David faces Goliath in the valley of Elah. While Saul and his army cower before the Philistine giant, this teenager steps forward with nothing but a sling and 5 smooth stones. But he doesn't step forward alone. He carries with him the anointing that was stripped from Saul, the divine favor that once made Israel's first king unstoppable in battle. When David's stone finds its mark and Goliath crashes to the earth, the cheers of Israel seal Saul's fate. The victory belongs to David, and everyone knows it. The women of Israel dance in the streets, singing a song that will torment Saul for years to come. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. In that moment, Saul realizes that his replacement isn't coming someday in the distant future. He's already here, already winning the hearts of the people, already demonstrating the divine blessing that Saul has lost. The evil spirit that torments Saul feeds on this jealousy, transforming it into something monstrous. The next day, while David plays his harp as usual, Saul hurls a spear at him, trying to pin him to the wall. This isn't a moment of temporary madness. It's the first deliberate attempt to murder the man God has chosen to replace him. And when David dodges the spear, something shifts permanently in their relationship. From this point forward, Saul becomes consumed with hunting David. He offers his daughter Michal in marriage to David, not out of love, but hoping that David will be killed trying to meet the bride price of 100 Philistine foreskins. When David succeeds and marries into Saul's family, the king's paranoia only deepens. Now his enemy is literally family, sleeping under his own roof, married to his own daughter. But here's where the curse becomes truly generational. Saul's obsession with David begins to poison his relationships with his own children. Jonathan, Saul's heir and David's closest friend, finds himself caught between loyalty to his father and loyalty to his friend. When Jonathan tries to reconcile them, Saul's response reveals how completely the curse has corrupted his judgment. At a feast, when Jonathan defends David's absence, Saul explodes with rage. "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman! Don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame, and to the shame of the mother who bore you? As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send someone to bring him to me, for he must die." Listen to those words carefully. Saul is cursing his own son, calling Jonathan's mother perverse and rebellious. He's so consumed with destroying David that he's willing to destroy his own family relationships. When Jonathan objects, Saul hurls a spear at him too. The king who should be protecting his heir is now trying to murder him. This is how curses work. They don't just affect the person who brings them on themselves. They spread like poison through family systems, corrupting relationships, destroying trust, and turning love into hatred. Saul's rebellion against God has created a spiritual toxicity that now threatens everyone close to him. The pursuit of David becomes Saul's obsession for years. He chases David through the wilderness with 3,000 chosen men, turning the future king into a fugitive living in caves and strongholds. Multiple times, David has the opportunity to kill Saul, but he refuses to raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. This restraint only seems to drive Saul deeper into madness. In one of the most disturbing episodes, Saul's paranoia leads him to slaughter 85 priests at Nob because he believes they've been helping David. These aren't warriors or rebels. They're holy men whose only crime was showing hospitality to someone they believed was still loyal to the king. Saul orders his guards to kill them, but when they refuse to raise their hands against the priests of the Lord, he commands Dog the Edomite to do the deed. The massacre is complete. 85 priests die, along with their families, their children, even their livestock. Only one priest, Abiathar, escapes to tell David what has happened. This isn't just murder. It's sacrilege of the highest order, the slaughter of God's servants by the man who is supposed to protect them. The curse on Saul's house deepens with every drop of innocent blood that's shed. But perhaps the most chilling moment in Saul's descent comes when he visits the Witch of Endor. By this time, Samuel has died, and Saul faces his final battle against the Philistines without any divine guidance. The Lord doesn't answer him through dreams, through the Urim, or through prophets. In desperation, despite his own laws against consulting mediums, Saul disguises himself and seeks out a witch. He asks her to bring up Samuel from the dead, and what happens next terrifies even the medium. Samuel's spirit actually appears, but his message isn't comfort. It's final judgment. Why do you consult me, now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David, because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites. The Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The curse that began with Saul's disobedience is about to claim not just the king, but his children as well. The sins of the father are preparing to be visited upon the sons in the most literal and tragic way possible. The next day, the prophecy comes true with devastating precision. On Mount Gilboa, the Philistines overwhelm Israel's army. Jonathan, the noble prince who tried to bridge the gap between his father and David, falls in battle. Abinadab and Malchishua, Saul's other sons, die alongside their brother. When Saul himself is critically wounded by Philistine arrows, he begs his armor-bearer to finish him off rather than let him fall alive into enemy hands. When his armor-bearer refuses, Saul takes his own sword and falls on it. The first king of Israel dies by his own hand, surrounded by the bodies of his sons, his army scattered, his kingdom lost. The Philistines find the corpses the next day and cut off Saul's head, stripping him of his armor and sending news of his death throughout their territory. They fasten his body to the wall of Beth-shan, along with the bodies of his sons as a public display of their victory. But even in death, the curse isn't finished with Saul's bloodline. His surviving son, Ishbosheth, becomes a puppet king controlled by Abner, Saul's military commander. For 2 years, he reigns over the northern tribes while David rules Judah from Hebron. But Ishbosheth's reign is marked by weakness and instability. When Abner defects to David's side, 2 of Ishbosheth's own captains murder him in his bed, cutting off his head and bringing it to David as a trophy. David's response reveals the righteousness that sets him apart from Saul. Instead of rewarding the murderers, he executes them for killing an innocent man in his own house. But the damage is done. Another of Saul's sons is dead. Another branch of the cursed bloodline has been cut off. Now only one direct descendant of Saul remains alive, Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, who was crippled as a child when his nurse dropped him while fleeing news of the battle at Mount Gilboa. He lives in exile in Lodabar, whose name means place of nothing, surviving on the charity of strangers in a land that has forgotten his grandfather's dynasty. But the curse still isn't satisfied. Years later, during David's reign, a famine strikes the land for 3 consecutive years. When David seeks the Lord about the cause, he receives a chilling answer. It is on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It is because he put the Gibeonites to death. This refers to an incident that happened years earlier, when Saul attempted to break the covenant that Israel had made with the Gibeonites during Joshua's time. In his zeal to purify the land, Saul had tried to exterminate these protected people, violating a sacred oath that bound all of Israel. Now, even though Saul is long dead, the blood of the innocent Gibeonites cries out for justice, and God responds by withholding the rain that makes the land fruitful. When David consults the Gibeonites about what it would take to make atonement for Saul's crime, their answer is stark. They want 7 of Saul's descendants to be handed over for execution. Not money, not territory, not political concessions. Blood for blood, life for life, David faces an impossible choice. He could refuse and watch his kingdom slowly starve under the continuing famine. Or he could surrender 7 members of Saul's family to satisfy the demands of justice. In the end, he chooses to honor the ancient covenant, but he protects Mephibosheth because of his oath to Jonathan. Instead, he hands over 2 sons of Rizpah, Saul's concubine, and 5 grandsons born to Saul's daughter, Merab. 7 young men who had nothing to do with their grandfathers or fathers' crimes against the Gibeonites. 7 descendants who will pay the ultimate price for sins they never committed. The Gibeonites take them to Gibeah, Saul's hometown, and execute them on a hill before the Lord. Then they hang their bodies up as a public display, leaving them exposed to the elements during the barley harvest. For 5 long months from spring into fall, the corpses remain there while Rizpah, their heartbroken mother, keeps vigil beneath them. Day and night, she sits by the bodies of her dead sons, driving away the birds of prey and wild animals that would devour them. Her vigil becomes a powerful symbol of maternal love, persisting even in the face of divine judgment. This grieving mother, wrapped in sackcloth, protecting her children's remains with nothing but her presence and determination, creates one of the most haunting images in all of Scripture. When David finally hears about Rizpah's devoted watch, he's moved to action. He retrieves the bones of Saul and Jonathan from the men of Jabesh-Gilead, who had risked their lives to give them proper burial years earlier. Then he gathers the remains of the 7 executed descendants and buries them all together in the tomb of Saul's father in the land of Benjamin. Only then does God respond to the prayers for the land, and the famine ends. The curse that began with Saul's disobedience has finally extracted its full price. 7 lives given for the lives Saul took. 7 descendants executed for their forefathers' broken covenant. 7 bodies hung on a hill as a testament to the far-reaching consequences of spiritual rebellion. But even this isn't the end of the story. The curse on Saul's bloodline will echo through generations in ways that no one could have predicted. Hidden in the shadows of history, descendants of this fallen dynasty will emerge at crucial moments, carrying both the weight of their ancestors' failure and the possibility of redemption that only God can provide. What comes next will surprise you, because sometimes the greatest curses become the setting for the greatest displays of divine mercy. The bloodline that seemed destined for extinction will produce heroes who save their people, proving that even the darkest family legacies can be transformed by the power of God's grace. The aftermath of those 7 executions should have marked the end of Saul's cursed bloodline. With the bones of the dead finally laid to rest and the famine lifted from the land, it seemed as though divine justice had been satisfied. The house of Saul had paid the ultimate price for their patriarch's rebellion, and Israel could move forward into a new era under David's righteous reign. But curses have a way of lingering in the bloodstream of families, passing from generation to generation like spiritual DNA that carries both the weight of past failures and the seeds of future redemption. What most people don't realize is that Saul's lineage didn't actually end on that hill at Gibeah. Hidden in the genealogical records scattered across the pages of Scripture are traces of descendants who survived the purge and carried the royal blood of Benjamin into the future. Mephibosheth, the crippled grandson whom David spared, wasn't just a symbol of mercy. He was a living link to a bloodline that God wasn't finished with yet. Despite his physical limitations, despite living in exile in a place called Nothing, Mephibosheth had a son named Micah, and Micah had 4 sons whose names are recorded in the Chronicles: Pithon, Melech, Tereah, and Ahaz. Through these forgotten men, the genetic legacy of Israel's first king continued to flow forward through time. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. For centuries, this bloodline would remain in obscurity, bearing the shame of their ancestors' failures while quietly preserving something that even they probably didn't understand. They carried within their veins not just the curse of Saul's disobedience, but also the royal calling that God had originally placed upon their family line. The tribe of Benjamin itself seemed to bear the weight of their most famous son's failure. After the kingdom split following Solomon's death, Benjamin remained loyal to the house of David, becoming part of the southern kingdom of Judah. They were a small tribe, overshadowed by their larger neighbors, often forgotten in the grand narratives of kings and prophets. Yet they preserved their genealogies with meticulous care, as if they knew that someday their lineage would matter again. That someday came during one of the darkest periods in Jewish history, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and dragged the survivors into exile. It seemed like the end of everything. The temple lay in ruins, the Davidic monarchy was finished, and the people of God were scattered among the nations like sheep without a shepherd. For 70 years, they languished in foreign lands, wondering if the promises of their ancestors would ever be fulfilled. But exile has a way of refining people, burning away the dross and revealing what's truly valuable. During those long years in Babylon, something happened to the Jewish people that transformed them from a defeated nation into a people with an unshakable identity. They learned to worship without a temple, to maintain their faith without a king, and to trust in God's promises even when everything visible contradicted those promises. When Cyrus the Persian issued his decree allowing the Jews to return to their homeland, among those who made the dangerous journey back were descendants of Benjamin. They came not as conquerors, but as servants, not as royalty, but as ordinary people committed to rebuilding what had been destroyed. Yet within their ranks, unknown to most, flowed the blood of Saul, carrying with it both the memory of ancient failure and the possibility of future redemption. The post-exilic period was a time of struggle and reconstruction. The returned exiles faced opposition from their neighbors, internal conflicts over leadership, and the overwhelming task of rebuilding not just their cities, but their spiritual identity. The Second Temple, when it was finally completed, seemed pathetic compared to Solomon's original masterpiece. The walls of Jerusalem lay in rubble for decades before Nehemiah arrived with the authority and resources to restore them. During this time, the tribe of Benjamin played a crucial but often overlooked role in the restoration. They provided scribes who helped preserve and transmit the sacred texts. They produced craftsmen who worked on the temple reconstruction. They gave leaders who helped organize the community and establish the systems that would sustain Jewish life for centuries to come. Yet most of them lived in relative anonymity, their famous ancestor's name more of a burden than a blessing. But God's timing is never accidental. During the reign of the Persian Empire, when the Jewish people had been scattered throughout the known world, a crisis emerged that would threaten their very existence. A powerful official named Haman, driven by personal hatred and racial prejudice, convinced King Ahasuerus to issue a decree that would result in the genocide of every Jewish person in the empire. The irony of this moment is staggering. Haman wasn't just any enemy of the Jews. According to the text, he was an Agagite, a descendant of the very Amalekite king whom Saul had spared in disobedience to God's command. The sin that had started the curse on Saul's bloodline was about to come full circle, as the descendant of Agag prepared to finish what his ancestor had started, the complete destruction of God's people. But in the palace of Shushan, unknown to almost everyone, lived a young Jewish woman whose own ancestry traced back through the centuries to that same cursed bloodline. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah, though the Persians knew her as Esther. And her cousin Mordecai, who had raised her as his own daughter after her parents died, was also a descendant of Benjamin, carrying in his veins the royal blood of Saul. When the text introduces Mordecai, it doesn't just give his immediate genealogy. It traces his lineage back through his great-grandfather Shimei to Kish, the father of Saul. This isn't accidental information. The author wants us to understand that the man who will save the Jewish people from Haman's plot is a direct descendant of the king, who failed to destroy Haman's ancestor when he had the chance. Think about the spiritual dynamics at work here. For centuries, the curse on Saul's bloodline had manifested in death, defeat, and exile. His descendants had paid a terrible price for his disobedience, watching their family members executed, their inheritance stripped away, their very survival hanging by a thread. Yet here, in this moment of ultimate crisis, two descendants of that same cursed lineage find themselves positioned to become the saviors of their people. Esther's rise to become queen wasn't just political maneuvering or fortunate circumstances. It was the culmination of a divine plan that had been centuries in the making. Every tragedy that had befallen Saul's family, every execution and exile and humiliation, had been leading to this moment when their descendant would have the power to save not just herself but every Jewish person in the known world. When Mordecai first tells Esther about Haman's plot, her initial response reveals how completely she understands the danger she faces. To approach the king without being summoned could mean death. To reveal her Jewish identity could cost her everything. But Mordecai's words to her carry the weight of all those generations of family history. Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? This phrase has become famous, but listen to it in the context of the cursed bloodline. For such a time as this. As if all the suffering, all the judgment, all the apparent failure of Saul's dynasty had been preparation for this moment. As if God had been working through even the curse itself to position the right person in the right place at the right time to accomplish his purposes. When Esther finally acts, calling for 3 days of fasting before she approaches the king, she's not just preparing for a political maneuver, she's preparing for spiritual warfare. The same forces that had corrupted her ancestor Saul with pride and disobedience are still at work in the world, now manifesting through Haman's murderous hatred. But this time, instead of yielding to fear and self-preservation, a descendant of Saul chooses to risk everything for the sake of her people. The confrontation between Mordecai and Haman throughout the story mirrors the original conflict between their ancestors. Haman's rage at Mordecai's refusal to bow down echoes Agag's arrogance when he thought he had escaped death. Mordecai's quiet dignity in the face of threats reflects what Saul should have been: a leader who trusted God more than circumstances, who valued obedience more than personal safety. And when Haman finally meets his end, hanging on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai, it completes a circle of justice that began centuries earlier when Saul spared Agag's life. The mercy that Saul showed to God's enemy has now been repaid with the execution of that enemy's descendant. The curse that began with disobedience finds its resolution in the obedience of Saul's descendants. But the most remarkable aspect of this reversal isn't just that evil is punished and good is rewarded. It's that the very bloodline that had been marked for destruction becomes the instrument of salvation. The family that had brought shame upon Israel becomes the family that saves Israel from extinction. The curse transforms into blessing not through the erasure of the past, but through the redemption of it. This pattern reveals something profound about how God works through human history. He doesn't simply discard the broken vessels and start over with new ones. Instead, he takes the very brokenness and uses it as raw material for something beautiful. The cracks in the pottery become the places where his light shines through most brilliantly. The descendants of Saul who lived after the time of Esther would have known this story. They would have understood that their family's legacy wasn't defined solely by their ancestors' failures, but also by their own choices in moments of crisis. The curse that had seemed to doom them had actually prepared them to be instruments of redemption when the time was right. This transformation didn't happen automatically or without cost. Each generation had to choose whether they would repeat the patterns of the past or break free from them. Each individual had to decide whether they would be defined by their inheritance or would define their own destiny through faithful obedience to God. The story of Saul's cursed bloodline ultimately becomes a story about the power of redemption to transform even the most hopeless situations. It demonstrates that no family legacy is so dark that it cannot be illuminated by divine grace, no curse so powerful that it cannot be broken by human choices made in faith. But perhaps most importantly, it reveals that God's plans are far larger and more complex than human understanding can grasp. What appears to be judgment may actually be preparation. What seems like an ending may actually be a beginning. And what looks like a curse may actually be the first chapter of a blessing that will unfold across generations. The bloodline that began with a king's disobedience and seemed destined for extinction had become a conduit for salvation. The family marked by divine judgment had produced heroes who saved their people. The curse had been transformed into blessing, not by being forgotten or ignored, but by being faced honestly and overcome through faithful action. And in this transformation, we see a reflection of the greatest redemption story of all. How God takes our failures and uses them as part of His plan to bring salvation to the world. The cursed bloodline of Saul becomes a preview of the gospel itself, where death leads to life, where judgment becomes mercy, and where the very worst of human failure becomes the stage for divine grace to display its transforming power.